Slots have taken over my design system. In this video, I'll break down exactly where I'm using slots in my design system with some helpful tips along the way. I'm Rachel, welcome to Show Your Work, the series where designers geek out and get in the file, showing you how we're building with Figma. Alright, so there's a few categories in a design system where slots really make sense. The first being repeating elements. So these are going to be components like menus, lists, tabs, checkbox groups, radio groups, all of these patterns where you're really seeing kind of the same thing over and over again. And this can even apply to some components that you might not initially think it does. For example, something like a chat component. Notice how for several of these components, I have the main component, like the menu, and then a few nested subcomponents, like the menu item, menu heading, and menu divider. This is good practice in general to reduce variance and maintain flexibility in your system, but it's especially helpful when it comes to slots. Let's say I designed this same menu component without using any nested instances, simply including the headings, menu items, and dividers as frames as default content within that slot. The editing experience would be very similar, but if later on I wanted to make a change to that component at the system level, say adding a background color to that menu heading, the changes won't reflect in any modified slot instances. Defining those building blocks up front gives me that control later. So in this version of the menu, notice that if I add an instance to the canvas, and then I change the background color of that menu heading, you can see that the changes reflect even if the slot contents have been modified. The second category of slot components I have are more freeform content areas, things like sheets, modals, and cards. Something you might notice about these components is that the default state looks a little bit different. Where in the previous components, I included some default content to provide a template for something like a menu or a list, in many of these, I'm actually not including any default content at all. And the reason being is that if we look at the usage of some of these components that are intended to support more flexible layouts, like this accordion, we can see that the layouts vary so much that default content is often just going to be a hindrance and something that designers have to go in and delete to really use that component anyway. So as I built out these components with freeform content areas, I started to feel like some of my components were just becoming a rectangle with a slot inside. Like I was creating a blank canvas and just hoping for the best. So to bring a bit more structure in, I started to include multiple slots in the same component. A good example of this is this card component. And then if we look at the ways that that card can be used, you can see that there's a ton of variation in each of those slots, but it still really holds together with a consistent structure. This last category is a bit more experimental, and I'll leave you with this as some food for thought. As I was building out my components, I realized that slots allowed me to think about components in a whole new way, often layering them together to create higher order layouts like page-level templates. This isn't something I'm using everywhere yet, but it's definitely something that's interesting to experiment with because it starts to feel a lot more like code. Really, everything can be a component with slots, and this has some interesting implications, especially when we think about how AI agents can interact with your system to create really accurate and structured layouts. So not 100% there yet, but definitely an area for us all to continue exploring as we use slots. Just as important as where I'm using slots in my design system is where I'm not. So for things like an icon as a leading item in a button, or a list item with leading and trailing items, I'm sticking with instance swaps. A helpful way you can think about this is that slots are meant for building and instance swaps are meant for choosing. They serve totally different purposes, and there's definitely still a place for both. To recap, slots have become a key tool for making my system flexible while reducing complexity. I use them to handle repeating elements, support freeform content areas, and even experiment with component types that weren't possible before, like page-level templates. This is how I'm using slots in my design system, but there are so many different ways to use them in yours. I'm Rachel, and this was Show Your Work. Let us know in the comments how you're using slots and what you'd like to see next.